Hey folks, we've already discussed the historical context of some of the literature we're going to be looking at in these first several weeks of the semester. We also need to talk about the type of literature we're going to be studying, which is literature created by an oral culture, and how that's different than literature created from a literate culture. Since we are so much a part of literate culture, it can sometimes be difficult for us to understand how these ancient texts work. We're going to try to clear up some of that now. Why should we study the difference at all? The first reason is that these oral stories, or these stories that were created in oral cultures, have different elements and they function differently than those created in literate cultures. Consequently, the stories can seem downright weird. In fact, when I've taught classes like ours before, by the second or third week of the semester, at least a few students are always asking, why is the literature so weird? What's wrong with the people who wrote it? These questions about the weirdness of the literature point at the second feature or second reason we should study the difference, which is that oral cultures operate on a much different mindset than literate cultures, at least according to the framework we're going to use. We do need to acknowledge one critical point, which is all of the stories we're studying, have been transformed into writing, which means that they went from being oral stories to written or literate stories. And in that transformation, some features of the original were probably lost, transformed, modified, and we need to be on the lookout to understand where those differences are. So what's our framework going to be? Our framework is going to draw on the work of a scholar named Walter Ong. Walter Ong's most famous work is his book Orality and Literacy, where he argues that in the shift from the oral culture to the literate culture, many things about how humans understand their world changed. Now, before we get into Ong's theory, let's just identify several of the major challenges that have been raised to it. All of these are valid. The first one is that Ong considers overly Western texts and tends to interpret everything through a Western, which is to say a European mindset. This is problematic because it reduces and simplifies texts from other cultures. Secondly, Ong is trying to totalize pretty much all of human experience, and those activities are almost always prone to failure. The old joke, the only two things you can count on are death and taxes, is probably valid here. The third point is that although Ong worked enormously hard to make sure that each of his points were grounded in established and generally well-regarded research, some of the research he draws on has been refuted or at the very least called into question. His main claim, though, which seems to be pretty much valid, is that the introduction of literacy forever changes a culture. That means that once a culture starts to think in the literate mindset, it can't fully get back to the oral mindset, and those oral ways of looking at the world are largely lost or invalidated. But he goes on to argue that fortunately, literacy, though it consumes its own oral antecedents and, unless it is carefully monitored, even destroys their memory, is also infinitely adaptable. It can restore their memory too. Literacy can be used to reconstruct for ourselves the pristine human consciousness which was not literate at all, at least to reconstruct this consciousness pretty well, though not perfectly. We can never forget enough of our familiar present to reconstitute in our minds any past in its full integrity. Such reconstruction can bring a better understanding of what literacy itself has meant in shaping men's consciousness toward and in high technology cultures. Such understanding of both orality and literacy is what this book, which is of necessity a literate work and not an oral performance, attempts in some degree to achieve. To say that more simply, Ong argues that we can get back close enough to the oral culture if we work hard to understand what it was doing and how its texts worked. This ability to get back to some proximity of the oral culture is critical because we want to be able to interpret these texts in two broad ways. The first is we want to understand what they tell us about the culture that created them. And to do that, we need to be able to adopt or at least identify as many of that culture's values as we can. We also want to be able to bring these stories up to date and think about what they mean for us today. You may have read the Iliad or the Odyssey in high school, and it's worth considering why a text that's more than 3,000 years old is still relevant enough to make most people read it as part of their general education. It must have some value to us. And the interesting question to ask is if the value it has for us now is the same as it was for the people who originally told it. Or to ask us a little bit better question, in what ways is it the same and in what ways has it differed? Before we go on, let's define our terms. We need to start by talking about what it means to say something is an oral culture. Ong defines cultures that have never encountered literacy as being primarily oral. And he writes that primarily oral cultures, that is, of oral cultures untouched by writing, fully literate persons can only with great difficulty imagine what a primary oral culture is like. That is, a culture with no knowledge whatsoever of writing or even of the possibility of writing. In a primary oral culture, the expression to look up something is an empty phrase. It would have no conceivable meaning. Without writing, words as such have no visual presence, even when the objects they represent are visual. They are sounds. You might call them back, recall them, but there is nowhere to look for them. They have no focus and no trace, a visual metaphor showing dependency on writing. Not even a trajectory. They are occurrences, events. What this means is that in oral cultures, the idea of memory is fundamentally different than it is in a literate culture. In a literate culture is one in which a significant portion of the populace is literate and the features of literate thought have permeated the culture. In this sense, it is not necessary for an individual to be able to read and write to be considered part of a literate culture. Okay, there are 2 points here we want to unpack. The first one is that in a literate culture, we assume that there is, from almost everything, a fixed body of knowledge that we could go look up. We might, for instance, forget the Pythagorean theorem or how Shakespeare's play The Othello opens, but we know that we could go look those things up. The other thing is that once we're in a literate culture, literate and illiterate mean different things. Illiterate people in American culture today are almost certainly fully part of a literate culture, which means that they see the world in ways that are associated with Ong's idea of literacy. Let's move on. Although Ong draws pretty hard distinctions in these definitions between oral and literate cultures, it's worth noting that they exist on a continuum and that the movement from one to the other is slow and often resisted. Socrates, in Aristotle's Dialogues, has a conversation with a person named Phaedrus. In that, Socrates talks about the limitations of writing. He says, "You know, Phaedrus, writing shares a strange feature with painting. The offsprings of painting stand there as if they are alive, but if anyone asks them anything, they remain most solemnly silent. The same is true of written words. You'd think they were speaking as if they had some understanding, but if you question anything that has been said because you want to learn more, it continues to signify just that very same thing forever. When it has once been written down, every discourse roams about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding, no less than those who have no business with it, and it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. And when it is faulted and attacked unfairly, it always needs its father's support. Alone, it can neither defend itself nor come to its own support." What's happening here is Socrates is challenging the idea that writing is inherently valuable. This was something that the ancient Greeks were struggling with around the time of the three great ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. So we want to make sure that we don't assume that this transition is easy. Additionally, it's useful to think about the distinction between oral and literate culture as being on something of a continuum. Cultures tend to move from oral to literate, but it is not always as simple as that. Having talked about the mindset a bit, let's talk about the features of oral versus literate cultures. The first one has to do with memory. In oral culture, the most important part of thinking is to be able to memorize, to remember what has been said and what has been thought, so that thinking itself becomes mnemonic, which means that people think in ways which is easy to memorize. Because if anything is ever lost, if anything is ever forgotten, it's gone for good. There's nowhere to look it up. In a literate culture, memory tends to become increasingly externalized. We don't have to remember Pythagorean's theory because we can go look it up in a book. We don't have to remember all of Shakespeare's plays because they're written down for us. And ironically, in the last decade or so, in computers, something has happened called second brains. And the idea is that you dump all of your knowledge into some sort of database so that you don't have to remember it anymore. You just have to remember where to go looking for it. A second feature of oral versus literate thought is that oral thought tends to be contextual and situational, which means that judgments and ideas of good and bad almost always depend on a particular situation. Additionally, the conclusions that are drawn tend to be concrete and practical. So that when Odysseus, after returning home, decides to slaughter all of the suitors, while we might look at that and question the morality of premeditated murder, for the ancient Greeks, it wasn't so much of a problem. Odysseus was supposed to be in charge of his house. The suitors had tried to take that away from him, and so in this context, his actions were fine. Literate thought, on the other hand, tends to be abstract and analytic, theoretical, and speculative. So we might look at Odysseus's actions and wonder if they meet some larger standard, and wonder what would happen if we tried to generalize from them and allow everybody to behave that way. These are questions that just wouldn't occur to the oral mind. At least that's what Walter Ong says. Because in an oral culture, for something to be forgotten is for something to be lost forever. The primary objective is to conserve and preserve knowledge. If something works, we hold on to that thing tenaciously. In literate culture, where we're not so worried about forgetting, we focus much more on innovation and discovering new knowledge. Oral culture tends to produce stories that are additive and sequential. That means that we will often see sentences or passages joined together with words like "and." This happened, and that happened, and the next thing happened. Because the goal is to preserve the sequence and to preserve the idea of the elements that happened. In literate culture, because we're not so worried only about memory, we can start to subordinate ideas and create hierarchical structures. So one idea can be dependent on another instead of just happening alongside it. And finally, another feature that helps, that focuses on memory. In oral cultures, there is a huge emphasis on redundancy. Things and phrases are repeated again and again to ensure that they are remembered. In literate culture, we tend to get frustrated with redundancy and focus instead on efficiency and conciseness. That's because we can always go back and reread the passage if we didn't understand it. It doesn't need to be redundant. One important question we should be asking ourselves at this time is, given these frameworks of thought, how were these stories remembered? The Iliad is hundreds of pages long. The Odyssey is also hundreds of pages long. How were these texts remembered? It used to be thought that the memory in the oral tradition worked very much like it does today in the literate tradition. People would just memorize it from beginning to end and somehow hold a perfect copy in their head. You may have done something similar to this when you were asked to memorize a poem or the Gettysburg Address or the opening to the preamble of the Constitution. The goal is to get it letter perfect correct. Someone by the name of Milman Parry, who Walter Ong draws on heavily, concluded that that is not how these stories were remembered in the oral traditions. He came to this conclusion after studying the texts as well as talking to some pre-contact oral cultures that were around at the time, usually in geographically remote areas, and looking at how they remembered their stories. He found that there were three main elements, three main ways that they retained the stories. The first is that the storyteller would learn and remember key narrative elements. These might be stories about the feast or the departure of the hero or the great battle. The idea is that the speaker remembers the general outline of the story. The second one is that the storyteller would have a bank of epithets. An epithet is a way of referring to something other than using its name. And these epithets would be of various lengths and of various metrical patterns. So, for example, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is sometimes called cunning Odysseus, sometimes called much enduring Odysseus, sometimes called the man of pain, and so on. And the idea is that each one of these would fit a slightly different slot. And these slots would occur within the formal structure of the line. So the storyteller would also have internalized the elements of the poetic line that they're telling a story in. For the Homeric stories, this is dactylic hexameter. A dactyl is a poetic foot, which means a unit of sound. It goes unstressed, stressed, stressed. And hexameter tells us that there are 6 of these per line. Originally, it was thought that the storytellers were lockstep, would follow these patterns in lockstep and would simply repeat the dactylic pattern over and over again. But it didn't take long for people to realize that that's not what's happening, and if it were to happen, it would be incredibly dull. So we might think of these lines more as jazz. The oral storytellers were more like jazz musicians than they were like classical musicians. In fact, this analogy holds pretty well. If we listen to Pachelbel's canon, played piano and cello in a classical fashion, it sounds like this. So that version is beautiful. It's also an attempt to play it pretty much identical to how it is scored. Now let's listen to a jazz pianist play the same version. And we'll notice that while the underlying structure is always the same, there is quite a bit more innovation occurring. So, what are the benefits of recognizing the oral mindset and the aesthetics of oral literature for us in English Literature 340? I suspect there are about 3 overriding benefits, and they have to do with how we approach the texts. The first is that we need to understand that oral literature has different features than literate literature. If we try to read the oral text according to literate conventions, oral texts will seem at least weird and at most poorly constructed. Second, we need to understand that the overwhelming focus of these texts is not to discover new insights, but to preserve what is known. These literatures are trying to answer the most important questions that their people faced. For some of these questions, they'll be very close to the questions we ask today. For others, they might be quite a bit different. And third, and most important, we need to understand that these ancient texts were enormously important to the people who created and then preserved them. They invested significant energy in remembering them and then into transcribing them into written literature. Later, people would spend significant energy to make sure that those stories would continue till today. I hope you found this discussion of oral literature useful, and you'll let me know if you have any questions. Cheers.